Chairman Watt, and greetings to my old friend, Congressman Ron Paul, and to the members. Thank you for the opportunity to present my appraisal of the administration's proposal for regulatory changes. I will confine most of my comments to the role of the Federal Reserve as a systemic regulator, and will offer an alternative proposal much closer to the Republican proposal. I share the belief that change is needed and long delayed, but appropriate change must protect the public, not the bankers. During much of the past 15 years, I have written 3 volumes entitled A History of the Federal Reserve. Working with 2 assistants, we have read virtually all of the minutes of the Board of Governors, the Federal Open Market Committee, and the directors of the Federal Reserve Bank. We have also read many of the staff papers and the internal memos supporting decisions. I speak from that perspective. 2 findings are very relevant for the role of the Federal Reserve. First, I do not know of any single clear example in which the Federal Reserve acted in advance to head off a crisis or a series of banking and financial failures. We all know of several where it failed to act in advance. Congress members should ask themselves this question: can you expect the Federal Reserve or anyone else as systemic regulators to close Fannie and Freddie after Congress has decided that it declined to act? What kind of a conflict is that going to pose, and how is it going to be resolved? Second, in its 96-year history, the Federal Reserve has never announced a lender of last resort policy. It has discussed internally the content of such a policy several times, but it rarely announced what it would do. And the announcements that it made, as in 1987, were limited to the circumstances of that time. Announcing and following a policy would alert financial institutions to the Fed's expected actions and might reduce pressures on Congress to aid failing entities. Following the rule in a crisis, the lender of last resort rule in a crisis would change bankers' incentives and reduce moral hazard. A crisis policy rule is long overdue. The administration proposal recognizes the need but doesn't propose the rule. Experiences in the past from the history suggest 3 main lessons. First, we cannot avoid banking failures, but we can keep them from spreading and creating crises. Second, neither the Federal Reserve nor any other agency has succeeded in predicting crises or anticipating systemic failure. It is hard to do, in part because systemic risk is not well defined. Reasonable people will differ, and since much is often at stake, some will fight hard to deny that there is a systemic risk. One of the main reasons that Congress in 1991 passed FDICIA, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation Improvement Act, was to prevent the Federal Reserve from delaying closure of failing banks, increasing losses, and weakening the FDIC fund. The Federal Reserve and the FDIC have not used FDICIA against large banks in this crisis. That should change. The third lesson is that a successful policy will alter bankers' incentives and avoid moral hazard. Bankers must know that risk-taking brings both rewards and costs, including failure, loss of managerial position, and equity, followed by sale of continuing operations. Several reforms are needed to reduce or eliminate the cost of financial failure to the taxpayers. Members of Congress should ask themselves and each other, is the banker or the regulator more likely to know about the risks on the bank's balance sheet? Of course it is the banker, and especially so if the banker is taking large risks that he wants to hide. To me, that means the reform should start by increasing the banker's responsibility for losses. The administration proposal does the opposite by making the Federal Reserve responsible for systemic risk. Systemic risk is a term of art. I doubt that it can be defined in a way that satisfies the many parties involved in regulation. Members of Congress will properly urge that any large failure in their district is systemic. Administrations and regulators will have other objectives. Without a clear definition, the proposal will bring frequent controversy, and without a clear definition, the proposal is incomplete. Resolving the conflicting interests is unlikely to protect the general public. More likely, regulators will claim that they protect the public by protecting the banks. I think that's wrong. I believe there are better alternatives than the administration's proposal. first step, end too big to fail. Require all financial institutions to increase capital more than in proportional to the increase in the size of their assets. Too big to fail is perverse. It allows banks to profit in good times and shifts the losses to the taxpayers when crises or failures occur. Second step, require the Federal Reserve to announce a rule for lender of last resort. Congress should adopt the rule that they are willing to sustain. The rule should give banks an incentive to hold collateral to be used in a crisis period. Bagehot's rule from the 19th century Bank of England is a great place to start. Third step, recognize that regulation is an ineffective way to change behavior. My first rule of regulation states that lawyers regulate, but markets circumvent burdensome regulation. The Basel Accord is a current example. It told banks to hold more reserves if they held more risky assets, so they put the assets off their balance sheets. Later, after the fact, they had to take them back, but that was after the fact. Fourth step, recognize that regulators do not allow for the incentives induced by their regulations. In the dynamic financial markets, it is difficult, perhaps impossible, to anticipate how clever market participants will circumvent the rules without violating them. Fifth step, either extend fiducia to include holding companies or subject financial holding companies to bankruptcy law. Make the holding company subject to early intervention either under fiducia or under bankruptcy law. That not only reduces or eliminates taxpayer losses, but it also encourages prudential behavior. Other important changes should be made. Congress should close Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and put any subsidy for low-income housing on the budget. The same should be done to other credit market subsidies. The budget is the proper place for subsidies. Three principles should be borne in mind. First, banks borrow short and lend long. Unanticipated large changes can and will cause failures. Our problem is to minimize the cost of failures to society. Second, remember that capitalism without failure is like religion without sin. It removes incentives for prudent behavior. Third, those that rely on regulation to reduce risk should recall that this is the age of Madoff. The Fed, too, lacks a record of success in managing large risks to the financial system, the economy, and the public. Incentives for fraud, evasion, and circumvention of regulation often have been more powerful than incentives to enforce regulation that protects the public. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman for